In the stillness of the night, moonlight filtered through the window, casting a hazy glow across the room. Alexander stood there, his deep-set eyes fixed on Sophie, the woman who had entered his life in a way no one could have foreseen. He stepped closer, holding a small black velvet box. When he opened it, it wasn't a sparkling ring inside, but an intricately crafted necklace. His voice was warm, tinged with hesitation. "I'm not giving you a ring, because this isn't a proposal. This is an invitation to stay." Sophie looked into his eyes, feeling the sincerity hidden in every word he spoke. She responded gently, "I'll stay. But not for the children, not for this house, not because anyone told me to. I'll stay, because for the first time, I believe in something that doesn't need to be written on paper." Their journey, from a cold agreement to genuine love, proved that sometimes the relationships that don't begin with love can still lead to true happiness. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment to share your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what comes next. Stay until the end to fully feel the depth of this emotional journey. A cold-hearted millionaire, a homeless girl, a contract with no feelings, yet it unlocked something no one could control. A sleek black McLaren slid through the damp streets of downtown New York, reflecting the streetlights like a streak of cold lightning. Inside the luxurious cabin, Alexander Reed, 42 years old, CEO of a tech empire spanning 18 countries, sat silently behind the wheel. His ash-grey eyes held a faraway look, more distant than any financial report or global strategy plan he usually handled like a child's game. He wasn't here for a meeting. He wasn't buying another skyscraper. There was no purpose. Just a strange night when sleep eluded him, so he drove aimlessly, thinking about the one thing all his power couldn't buy. A child, an heir, not because he wanted to be a father in the traditional sense. He had tried, twice married, once faced a miscarriage and ended with a bitter divorce. It left him feeling abandoned, manipulated, treated like a walking wallet. Alexander despised the notion of love. He believed it was an irrational, weak emotion that eroded control. But a child was different. A child was legacy, the next chapter of a great being, a continuation of bloodline, vision, and power. No feelings required, no relationship necessary, just a contract. The car stopped at an intersection. A light drizzle still fell from the sky. On the sidewalk, a young woman sat curled up, a thick coat hiding her frail shoulders. She was drawing something on a cardboard sign with a worn-down colored pencil. Her tangled dark brown hair covered one side of her face, but the other half revealed a pair of strikingly bright eyes that didn't seem to belong in the place she sat. Alexander frowned. He didn't care for the homeless. He didn't hand out money or donate to charity. But something about this girl kept his gaze locked. The focus, the calmness. As if the world around her was just a faded backdrop to a vivid world inside her mind. The light turned green. He was about to drive off, then stopped. A reflex, unplanned and uncharacteristic after so many years. A few minutes later, the car looped back. The girl was still there, now resting the cardboard on her knees, darkening the outline of something she had drawn. Alexander rolled down the window. "Hey, you." His voice wasn't loud, but sharp enough to make her flinch. She turned, her eyes wary. "I don't do services, if that's what you're thinking." She squinted, her voice tired but not submissive, almost defiant. Alexander narrowed his eyes. "I don't have time for nonsense. Get in, I want to talk." "You giving me orders now?" "No, I'm offering a choice. Get in or keep sketching in the rain." She hesitated, then stood up. The coat slid from her shoulder, revealing a stained, worn-out shirt and dirt on her ripped canvas shoes. She opened the door and sat in the passenger seat, her eyes never leaving his. "My name's Sophie," she said first. "Good, I'm Alexander, and I need someone to have a child for me." The air in the car froze for 3 full seconds. "What did you just say?" Sophie let out a dry, hollow laugh, like it had been choked off midway. "I'm serious," Alexander replied, unblinking. "A contract. I'll cover everything. Prenatal care, housing, wellness. After the baby is born, you get the money and you walk away. No strings, no contact." What do you think I am? A human incubator? I think you're someone sleeping on the streets, and this might be your only chance to start over. Sophie went silent. Her lips tightened. Not out of anger, but because he wasn't wrong. An hour later, they sat in a small cafe on a street corner. Sophie held a cup of hot cocoa, her hands trembling slightly from the cold and exhaustion. Alexander placed a file folder on the table: contract, legal terms, payment breakdowns. Why me? She asked. Because you have the eyes of someone who's lost everything, but still has pride. Sounds like a well-spoken insult. Alexander didn't react. I don't need you to trust me. I just need you to read the contract. Sophie looked down. The terms were bolded, clear, detailed, no emotions, just numbers. What about the baby? It'll be mine. I'll raise it. You'll have no rights. That's part of the agreement. She scoffed softly. You really think you can control everything with a contract? I've done it my whole life. Then, your life must be awfully lonely. They didn't speak for another 5 minutes. Only the soft clinking of a spoon against a cup filled the space. Finally, Sophie looked up. I need 24 hours. Alexander nodded. If you don't call within 24 hours, I'll assume it's a no, and I won't come back. Fair enough. She stood up. Before walking away, she turned back and looked him straight in the eye. You're not a bad man, but you're not exactly a good one either. I just want to be sure. If I agree to this, I'm not the only one making a sacrifice. Alexander watched her disappear into the thin curtain of rain. His heartbeat didn't quicken, but inside, there was a silence he had never felt before. For the first time in years, Alexander Reed felt he was no longer in control of himself. She lived surrounded by luxury, yet felt like an outsider. And he, watching her through reports, couldn't understand his own heart. 3 days later, a sleek black SUV stopped at the gates of a vast estate on the outskirts of the city. The automatic gates slowly opened, revealing a garden that looked like it had been lifted from a magazine cover. Neatly trimmed emerald grass, 2 rows of red maple trees lining the path toward an ivory mansion standing quietly in the vast space. Sophie Bennett sat still in the back seat, her hands clutching the hem of her worn-out sweater. She didn't know exactly what she had just done, or rather, she did, but she wasn't ready to name it. A decision, with no way back. She had called Alexander at the 23rd hour out of the 24 he'd given her. His voice on the phone was calm, emotionless, no surprise, no welcome. He had simply said, "A car will pick you up at 10 a.m. tomorrow. Be ready." And now here she was, standing before a door that led to a world she didn't belong to. The person who greeted her was a woman in her early 30s with neatly tied blonde hair, wearing a white blouse and grey slacks, like she had stepped straight out of a corporate office. "I'm Rachel Carter, Mr. Reed's personal assistant. Please come in." Her voice was gentle, but maintained a polite distance. Sophie stepped into the foyer, where light poured down through ceiling-high glass windows onto the sparkling white marble floor. Everything was too perfect, too clean, too unreal. Rachel led her upstairs. The room, no, the suite, was larger than every place Sophie had ever lived, combined. A bed with crisp white sheets, oak wood bookshelves, a private marble bathroom, and a large window looking out into the garden. "You'll be staying here throughout the pregnancy. If you need anything, just press the button by the bed," Rachel said with a smile. A polite, formulaic smile, neither warm nor cold. Sophie nodded, her eyes still unable to fully grasp what she was seeing. "Thank you, but where is he?" Rachel knew exactly who he was. "Mr. Reed is currently in a meeting. He rarely attends in person. I'll be managing your health throughout the process. A private doctor will come weekly for checkups." A reasonable explanation. And also a subtle warning: don't expect anything beyond the role you signed up for. That first evening, Sophie ate alone in her room. A dinner tray was brought up to her: pumpkin soup, steamed salmon, chia seed salad. Each dish plated like something out of a Michelin-starred restaurant. But when Sophie raised a spoonful of soup to her mouth, the sweet, grainy taste of pumpkin made her suddenly think of the bland porridge at the shelter. She set the spoon down. A lump rose in her throat. This world wasn't built for her. Meanwhile, downstairs, Alexander sat in his study. In front of him, a screen displayed Sophie's electronic medical records sent over by his private medical team. Mild history of malnutrition, low iron levels, psychological stress may affect hormone regulation. He read each line as if it were part of a contract. Cold, objective, but his eyes paused longer on one particular note. Sophie sketches every day as a form of emotional regulation. The psychologist had written it during the initial consultation. Alexander tapped a finger lightly on the desk. Sketching, a creative act, an effort to hold on to oneself. Strange. He had read hundreds of files, but none had ever felt so real. The next morning, Sophie woke to sunlight streaming into her room. She wasn't used to this kind of silence. No traffic, no voices, no damp cold seeping through thin layers of clothes. She stepped out onto the balcony. Below, the garden shimmered in soft green hues. Yet the weight of disconnection still pressed down on her. She turned back inside, about to sit on the bed, when she noticed a small paper bag placed on the table. No note. Inside, a box of high-end colored pencils and a brand-new large-format sketchbook with a thick cover. Sophie looked around. No one was there. She opened the box, flipped the first page, then froze. How did he know I liked to draw? That afternoon, Sophie was sitting in the second-floor hallway when Rachel approached. Mr. Reed will be arriving at the estate tonight. He may want to meet with you. Sophie frowned. Meet me? Why? I thought we didn't have to see each other. I don't know. I'm just passing on the message. Sophie stood up. She couldn't tell if what she felt was anxiety or curiosity. She didn't know whether to prepare herself or to guard herself. Late that night, she heard the car pull up outside. Alexander walked into the house wearing a white dress shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, tie loosened, his eyes tired but still holding that familiar air of control. He walked past the foyer, his gaze briefly catching Sophie standing on the staircase. They stopped. Neither spoke for a few seconds. Is everything all right? His voice was low, even. I guess so, she replied, arms crossed. Though I still don't understand why you picked me. Alexander stepped a little closer. Because you didn't beg. You didn't try to please me. You didn't try to run. He paused. And maybe because you looked at me like I was just another human being. Sophie was surprised, not by the words, but by how he said them. Not cold, not mocking, just genuine. I didn't know you were such a good observer, she muttered. Alexander said nothing, just nodded slightly, then turned to walk away. Thank you. For the sketchbook, Sophie called after him softly. Alexander didn't turn around, but the door to his study hesitated for half a second before quietly closing behind him. Not in the contract, not in the plan, only in the chests of two people too afraid to admit they were starting to feel. Rain tapped softly against the window pane, blending with the mist that gently fogged the glass. Inside the private clinic on the ground floor of the estate, Sophie lay on her side on the ultrasound bed, her shirt lifted above her stomach. A cold layer of gel slid across her skin, sending a slight shiver down her spine. Alexander sat beside her, arms crossed, his eyes focused on the black and white screen ahead. This was the first time he had attended a checkup in person, not out of duty, not out of doubt, just because. That morning, when Rachel had informed him of the routine appointment, something inside him made him say, I'll come along. No one objected, only a flicker of surprise crossed Sophie's eyes. She said nothing, but inside there was a subtle ripple, like a pebble falling into a pond she'd tried hard to keep still. Are we ready? Dr. McGregor, a calm, deep-voiced man in his 50s, gently moved the ultrasound probe over Sophie's belly. The screen began displaying the familiar, blurry images. Sophie held her breath. She had never experienced this moment before. The first time she had been forced to terminate before she even understood what it meant to be pregnant. This time was different. Even if it started with a contract, there was a life growing inside her now, and today she was about to hear it for the very first time. Beep, beep, beep. The sound started slow, then grew quicker, like the steady tapping of a small drum in an empty room. Sophie's eyes widened, her lips pressed together. That was the baby's heartbeat. Alexander sat still, but his gaze had shifted. It was no longer the look of a man monitoring progress. It was something else. A flicker of confusion, a faint wave of awe, something for which he had no name. "Are you okay?" Sophie turned her head slightly and whispered. Alexander gave a subtle nod. "Yeah, I didn't think I'd feel anything hearing it." "Neither did I," she whispered, still staring at the screen. Suddenly, Dr. McGregor frowned. He moved the probe slightly to the left, then to the right. He paused for a moment, then he spoke. "I think I know why your beta levels were a bit high." Alexander straightened in his seat. "Is there a problem?" The doctor smiled. "No, nothing concerning. It's just—" He rotated the screen and zoomed in on a small flickering point. 2 heartbeats, 2 amniotic sacs, 2 embryos. You're carrying twins." The entire room fell silent. Sophie closed her eyes for a second, then let out a soft laugh, half disbelief, half wonder. "I don't even know what to say." Alexander, a man who always had the right words for every situation, said nothing. He hadn't seen this coming. Nowhere in the contract had it mentioned 2 children. Nowhere in the plan had he prepared for that. He simply sat there, staring at the screen, as if the image might vanish if he didn't look long enough. Leaving the clinic, Sophie wrapped a thin sweater around herself and walked more slowly than usual. Rachel had returned to her duties, leaving the 2 of them alone in the stone-paved courtyard behind the mansion, where rare afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees after a rainy day. Alexander walked beside her, hands still in his pockets, gaze fixed forward, but clearly unfocused. "2," he repeated almost to himself. "Not happy about it?" Sophie asked, half joking, half serious. Alexander stopped. He turned to her but didn't answer right away. "I don't know what this feeling is." "Maybe call it stunned?" Sophie smiled. "Or gently panicked?" "I wasn't planning on a starting lineup," he replied, but his tone was no longer cold. Sophie tilted her head, studying him. "Maybe this wasn't your plan, but it could be part of someone else's, someone bigger." Alexander let out a slight smirk. He didn't believe in fate, but what was happening was starting to challenge that belief. That evening, Sophie didn't eat in her room. She came to the large dining table on the first floor, the one she hadn't once approached since arriving at the estate. Alexander was already there, sitting at the head of the table like a true master of the house. Light from the chandelier reflected off his neatly combed salt and pepper hair. She sat 2 seats away from him. A safe distance, but not an invisible one. They ate in silence. Until dessert was served, that's when Alexander looked up. "I've been thinking about bringing in a perinatal specialist. Twins can add twice the strain." "Thank you, but I'm fine." "I know," he said, placing his spoon down, "but I don't want you to just be fine. I want everything to be right." Sophie looked at him. "Because of the contract?" Alexander answered without hesitation. "Because of the twins, and because of you." A moment of silence. Sophie didn't speak. She didn't smile either. She just turned her face away quietly. But her heart, for the first time in a long time, skipped a beat. That night, in her moonlit second-floor room, Sophie sat by the window, flipping through the pages of her sketchbook. On the first page, she had drawn 2 small, glowing circles, close together, both radiating light, like 2 heartbeats, like 2 chances. No one expected a miracle to grow from a cold contract, born at the same time, in the same place, to change 2 people who had shut their hearts for far too long. She asked for nothing. But he began wanting to give more than what was agreed upon. Time passed faster than Sophie had expected. She once thought that every day in this mansion would stretch out like a slow-motion film, silent, isolated, and soulless. But surprisingly, life found its own rhythm, and strangely, she began to adapt. Each morning she woke to the sound of birds chirping on the glass rooftop. Twice a week, health checkups. 3 nutritionally balanced meals, always on time. And quiet afternoons spent alone in the garden, her box of colored pencils by her side. But what Sophie didn't expect were the small, quiet changes that weren't in any contract. The first time, it was the lumbar pillow, replaced with a newer, softer, more supportive one. Rachel simply said, Mr. Reed asked for the new model, better for spinal alignment during pregnancy. The second time, it was the vintage music player placed near her drawing chair on the veranda. No one asked what she liked, but the records it played were exactly the ones she'd once mentioned in passing. Chopin, nocturnes. And the third time was that morning. Sophie came downstairs to get a glass of water and unexpectedly found Alexander in the kitchen. One hand held a cup of espresso, the other flipped a page of the printed newspaper. He wore a white dress shirt and dark trousers, but his top button was undone, his hair slightly tousled, looking more approachable than the cold executive image she was used to. He saw her, but didn't seem surprised. "You're up early today." "I guess I slept enough." She was about to leave, but he gestured toward a chair. "Sit, I'll have someone make you some tea." Sophie hesitated, then took the seat across from him. A long silence followed. Only the soft clinking of a spoon in coffee and sunlight filtering through the blinds filled the room. Alexander spoke first. "I read your file, just the basics. Nothing in depth." "And I still know very little about you," Sophie replied, with a faint smirk. "I'm not that interesting, Mag," he said, "but you seem more complex than I thought." Sophie shrugged. "I don't try to be. I'm just not used to people being kind without expecting something in return." Alexander looked directly at her. "You think I'm trying to win you over? I think you don't know why you care about these small things." He said nothing, then gave a quiet nod. "You might be right." That afternoon, Sophie returned to the garden, sketching as usual. But today, she didn't draw landscapes. She drew a large hand, rough, slightly calloused, holding a smaller one, a child's. No faces, just the grip between them, but in the lines you could clearly see protection and an unspoken fear. As Alexander passed by, his gaze paused on the page. He didn't say anything, just stood there for a moment, then walked on. That evening, Rachel brought her a new maternity dress, soft beige fabric, simple yet elegant in design. No special request. Mr. Reed just said, "You should have something more breathable than those old t-shirts." Sophie held the dress, her fingers brushing the smooth fabric. This wasn't pity, it was intentional care, a kind of thoughtfulness she had never dared to dream of. 2 days later, on a misty morning, Sophie was walking through the garden when she saw Alexander on the upstairs balcony, talking on the phone. His voice was calm but sharp. "I don't care how much money is involved. If they don't properly inspect the shipment, it doesn't go out under the Reed Group name." He paused, turned back inside, unaware that Sophie had been standing below, silently watching. She had never met anyone like him. Cold, in control down to the last detail, and yet he silently replaced her pillow. Played Chopin just because she once mentioned it. Left a sketchbook at her door without needing a thank you. He wasn't trying to play the dad. He didn't even plan to be one. But he was learning to become someone else. A different version of himself, not out of obligation, but for something only the heart could understand. That night, Sophie sketched a portrait. It was him, not clearly defined, just the silhouette, glowing under the soft light of an old desk lamp. But the eyes, those she had drawn in detail, eyes always full of control, now gazing into the distance as if searching for something just out of reach. She whispered softly, "You think you're in control of everything, but what's changing is you." A sketch slipped to the floor, a silent pain, and for the first time, Alexander saw the part of Sophie's life she had never spoken of. It was a cloudy weekend afternoon, no rain, but the sky was thick with dark clouds, like a grey velvet curtain pulling gently over the world, dulling everything beneath it. Sophie chose not to go out to the garden as she usually did. Instead, she sat in a small room at the side of the mansion, once used as a reading lounge, now her makeshift art studio. Scattered sketches littered the floor, some pages wrinkled by overly heavy pencil strokes. She was drawing with both hands. Her left held the paper still, her right moved quickly, not to relax, but as if trying to push something out. Something stuck deep in her chest. Rachel walked in without knocking. "Sorry, I thought you were in your room." Sophie looked up and gave a slight nod. "It's okay, is something wrong?" Rachel placed a small paper bag on the table, some supplements the doctor prescribed. "I'll leave them here." As she turned to go, Her eyes caught a sketch that had fallen near the door. She bent to pick it up. Sophie reacted almost instinctively. "Don't!" Her voice was louder than usual, making them both freeze for a second. Rachel blinked, stunned. Sophie lowered her gaze, her voice quieter. "Sorry, I'm not ready for anyone to see that one." Rachel nodded. She didn't ask, she simply smiled and left in silence. Sophie picked up the drawing and held it to her chest, eyes shut tightly. That night, as Alexander walked past the second-floor hallway, he noticed the door to the drawing room was slightly ajar. He was going to walk past as usual, but a light breeze swept a piece of paper from inside out into the hall, brushing past his foot. He bent down. It was a pencil sketch. No title, no signature. A girl lay on a cold metal table, head turned away, hands clutching the edge of a hospital gown. Surrounding her were shadowy figures in white coats, faceless, expressionless. In the corner of the sketch, 2 drops of blood fell from the table to the floor, slowly blooming outwards, like the last breath of something that never had the chance to be born. Alexander stood frozen. He didn't need to ask. He understood. Sophie didn't know the sketch had been carried off by the wind. When she returned to the room to find it missing, a chill settled in her chest. She didn't dare ask anyone. The next morning, when she entered the dining room, she saw an envelope placed neatly at her seat. No name, no message. She opened it. Inside was the missing sketch, clean, uncreased, carefully sealed in a protective plastic sleeve. And with it, a small handwritten note in black ink. "If you're not ready to share it, don't force yourself, but if one day you want to, I'll be here to listen. A." Sophie sat down without touching her breakfast. Her fingers trembled slightly at the edge of the letter, not because she feared judgment, but because, for the first time in years, someone had seen her pain and didn't walk away. That afternoon, Sophie sought out Alexander's study. The wooden door was ajar. He was seated at his desk, sunlight streaming in through the window, casting a long line across the sleeve of his white shirt. She stood there for a moment, then gently knocked. "I was wondering if I could talk to you." Alexander looked up, motioned toward the chair across from him. "I've always been here." Sophie sat down. A long silence settled. At last she spoke. "When I was 19, I got pregnant." Alexander didn't blink. The father was the man who had sponsored my scholarship, an older businessman, charming in public, cruel when no one was watching. She looked up, straight at him. When he found out, he didn't call, didn't ask questions. He just sent someone to take me to a clinic outside the city. No paperwork, no explanations. I woke up with an empty stomach and an envelope of cash. Alexander's hands tightened slightly, not from anger at her, but from a rare rising fury, one he hadn't felt in a very long time. "I didn't take the money," Sophie continued. "I left, cut ties with everything, and I didn't draw for the next 3 years." Silence. Only the ticking of the clock filled the room. Sophie placed the sketch in front of him. "I don't draw to blame anyone. I draw to remind myself that I survived." Alexander looked at her for a long time. "I used to think, I chose you because you were easy. You didn't ask for anything. You weren't complicated. But now I know. I chose you because you're stronger than anyone I've ever met." Sophie smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "Strength is something you learn, when there's nothing left to lose." Alexander said nothing more, but in his eyes, for the first time, there was respect. And that made Sophie feel safe. That night, Sophie sat in the garden with a new drawing. This time, it was a man's arm, outstretched, not shielding, not holding, just reaching forward, like an invitation. Below it, a smaller hand, not clasping, but moving toward it. A choice, not pressure, not obligation, not a contract, just an open hand. And for the first time in her life, Sophie allowed herself to imagine the possibility of reaching back. He could calculate everything, except his own past. And one night, Sophie saw the part of Alexander's life he had never dared to face. Night fell over the mansion like a sheet of black silk draping over cold stone walls. The silence was so deep that every step on the wooden hallway echoed sharp and clear. Sophie lay awake in her room, tossing and turning. The twins in her belly had started their nightly protests. She'd grown used to the gentle kicks from inside, but the strangeness of it still kept her restless. She threw on a light robe and made her way downstairs, hoping to find some herbal tea in the kitchen. But just as she reached the end of the hall, she froze. A faint light was spilling through the crack beneath Alexander's office door. The clock read just shy of 1 a.m. She hesitated for a few seconds, then stepped forward and knocked softly, 3 times. No response. She pushed the door, gently. Alexander was sitting on the sofa by the window, the lights off. In his hand was a small photo frame, and under the dim, blurred glow from outside, Sophie could barely make out the image of a young woman holding a child. He didn't turn to look. His voice was low and tired. "I didn't hear you knock. Couldn't sleep. I was heading to the kitchen for some tea, saw your light still on." She stayed at the doorway. The room was filled with the scent of old paper and oak. Alexander placed the frame on the table, without hiding it, without explaining. "My mother, and me when I was a baby." A long silence stretched between them. Sophie hadn't expected him to share that. "She left when I was 6, Alexander continued, his eyes never leaving the photo. No note, no explanation, no one knew where she went or why. Just that one morning, I woke up, and the kitchen was empty." Sophie stepped into the room and sat on the edge of the armchair across from him. "Did you ever try to find her?" Alexander nodded slightly. "More than 20 years ago, I hired a private investigator. They traced her to somewhere in Europe, but the trail went cold. Some say she died, others claim she changed her name and started a new life. Eventually, I stopped looking." Sophie clenched her hands in her lap. "Were you angry at her?" Alexander didn't answer immediately. He stared into the darkness beyond the glass as if speaking to someone invisible. "At first, yes. Very angry. Then it turned into hurt. Then, numbness. I stopped feeling anything." Sophie swallowed. "And since then, you've learned never to let anyone get close enough to leave." Alexander turned to her. Their eyes met in the dark, raw, unguarded, frightening in their honesty. "You're smarter than I thought." Sophie gave a sad smile. "Not smart, just, I've been left behind too." Alexander leaned back into the sofa, resting his elbow on the armrest and pinching the bridge of his nose. He didn't try to hide the weariness. "I hate the feeling of letting someone close, only to see myself become small. To feel like I need someone." Sophie looked at him for a long time. She had never seen him like this, unmasked, uncertain, almost vulnerable, no longer the powerful CEO, no longer the stone fortress. Just a man, once a little boy abandoned by his mother, who had never been held with true affection since. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Alexander," she said softly. "Not with me." He smiled, just a little. "You're not afraid of me anymore." "I was never afraid of you. I just didn't think I could ever understand someone like you." "And now?" Sophie looked up at him, her gaze gentler. "Now, I think I do." Alexander pushed himself up and walked toward the bookshelf, but he stopped in front of the window instead. A long silence settled in. "I once promised myself I'd never let emotions get involved in any relationship. No love, no attachment, just agreements, simple, clean. But I'm not a contract," Sophie said, not with defiance, just quiet truth. He turned to her, meeting her eyes. "You never were a contract, but I had to pretend you were, just to keep the distance." Sophie took one slow step forward. "Because you're afraid that if you need someone, you'll lose them again." He didn't answer, but in his eyes, for the first time in countless years, there was a silent admission. After that moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said was in the look they shared. Sophie turned and walked toward the door, but before leaving the room she paused. "Some scars. You can't see. But I believe we can still keep living. Not alone." Alexander didn't respond, but when she was gone, he walked over to the table and picked up the photo of his mother. For the first time, he flipped it over and pulled out a tiny folded note he had never dared to read in all these years. A faded slip of paper with a single line handwritten, "Forgive me when you're old enough to know what loneliness does to people." Alexander's hand closed gently around it. That night, he didn't sleep. But for the first time, he didn't feel cold. As the due date neared, everything that should have been clear became more uncertain than ever. Near the end of the 8th month, the calendar hanging in Sophie's room showed only a handful of red-marked days left. Each one a step closer to the moment 2 tiny lives would enter the world. But instead of excitement, Sophie felt as though she were approaching a cliff's edge, where every step forward was lined with jagged, unanswered questions. And Alexander was drifting away. Not physically, he was still there, still attending every checkup, still reminding Rachel to prepare the best for the upcoming delivery. But between them, something had shifted. No words, no arguments, just a quiet distance, like a crack spreading beneath the surface of a painted wall. Sophie didn't understand why. Or maybe she did. She just didn't want to believe it. One morning, while Rachel was checking her blood pressure in the medical room, Sophie asked softly, "Has Mr. Reed been very busy lately?" Rachel paused briefly, then replied with her usual professional tone, "The company is restructuring some investment portfolios in Asia. He's been working late more often." Sophie gave a slight nod. "I thought maybe he was trying to avoid me." Rachel didn't respond, but her silence, that was the answer. That afternoon, it rained. Nothing unusual, except for a sudden cramp that hit Sophie as she sat sketching. It wasn't severe, but sharp enough to make her freeze and clutch her belly, gasping for breath. Rachel immediately called the doctor, and less than 20 minutes later, Alexander appeared at Sophie's door. His suit jacket hastily slung over one shoulder, eyes red from lack of sleep. "What happened?" "Just a mild cramp. The doctor says it's nothing serious," Rachel reassured. "But it's also a sign that labor could start earlier than expected." Alexander nodded, but his eyes remained locked on Sophie. "How do you feel?" Sophie looked at him slowly. "I'm okay, just a little nervous." Alexander said nothing, but his voice was lower than usual. "You don't need to be afraid. Everything will be under control." Sophie let out a soft laugh. "You still think everything can be controlled? Even childbirth?" Alexander smirked faintly. But this time, the smile held no sarcasm. "At least I can try." They looked at each other for a long moment, but neither touched the real thing that needed to be said. That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. She stepped onto the balcony, where rain still clung to the cold stone railing. Before her, the sky stretched in a dark void. No moon, no stars. Inside her, questions spun like the wheels of fate. "Once I give birth, I'll leave." That's what we agreed. But what about her heart? And Alexander's eyes? Each time he looked at her like he was about to say something, but always swallowed it back. The next morning, Sophie received an unexpected note. "After dinner, please come to the South Greenhouse. Mr. Reed would like to speak with you privately." For the first time, the invitation was handwritten. Sophie arrived on time. The greenhouse glowed under soft lighting. On the stone table were 2 steaming cups of tea, and a small vase, lavender, pale purple, the same shade as the dress she had often worn recently. Alexander stood by the glass, his back to her. "I don't suppose you invited me here just for tea," Sophie said. He turned around. In his hand was a document, the original contract between them. "I've been rereading this," he said. "Everything is crystal clear. No strings, no emotions, no future." Sophie tightened her grip. "Are you trying to remind me of that?" Alexander sat down, eyes never leaving hers. "No, I wanted to ask if you'd like to change anything." Sophie blinked, surprised. "What did you just say?" "I've spent my whole life believing I didn't need anyone, that emotions were nothing but complications. But these past few months, you and the twins have made me question that." He placed the contract on the table. "You have every right to leave, and I won't stop you, but if you want to stay, for any reason, I'll rewrite every clause." Sophie looked at him, her eyes welled. "You say that like everything can be changed with a few lines of text." Alexander shook his head, voice tight. "I'm not saying that. I'm just trying to learn how to keep someone without hurting them. And I want to start with an honest offer." Sophie stepped forward and slowly placed her hand on the contract. I don't need a new contract, Alexander. He froze. I only need one thing. When the time comes, when I'm in that delivery room, sweat on my forehead, pain blinding my senses, I just need you to be there. Not because of the agreement, but because I don't want to be alone. Alexander looked at her, then nodded slowly. I'll be there. For the first time, a promise wasn't written on paper. It was engraved in the heart. He thought he was strongest when he controlled everything. But when that first cry echoed through the room, his heart finally melted. The phone rang at exactly 3:18 a.m. Rachel was the first to wake. She caught a glimpse of the screen. Dr. Allen, before answering. Sophie is showing signs of labor, the doctor said, urgency in his voice. We need to get her to the hospital immediately. It's twins. We shouldn't wait. Within 5 minutes, every light in the mansion was on. Alexander appeared, his shirt only half-buttoned, face stern but eyes filled with tension. He didn't speak, just looked at Rachel and nodded. Get the car ready. In the car, Sophie sat in the back seat, gripping both armrests. Sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the gentle air conditioning. She breathed steadily, just as the doctor had taught, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Alexander sat beside her. He gently wrapped his hand around her wrist. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Sophie looked at him without a word, but in her eyes, for the first time, Alexander saw a reflection of himself. A man who wasn't sure he was ready, but who knew with absolute certainty he wouldn't walk away from this moment. The hospital was fully prepped. Under pale, sterile lights, Sophie was wheeled into the delivery room. Alexander followed close behind, despite the nurse's request. Mr. Reed, please wait outside. I promised I wouldn't let her be alone. Something in his voice made the entire room go still. Inside, Sophie screamed as the first contraction hit. She had practiced. She had studied every breath, every rhythm. But now, after all her strength over these past months, her body felt like it was breaking apart. Alexander stood at her side, sweat lining his own brow, his hand clutched hers, his voice steady. You're doing so well, Sophie. Just a little more. It hurts, she gasped. I'm scared. He leaned in, his voice at her ear. I know, but you're not alone. I'm right here. And I'm not leaving. The sound of the fetal heart monitor filled the room, fast, erratic, tense. The doctors moved more urgently. Get ready. Baby B's heart rate is fluctuating. We need to move quickly. Sophie gripped Alexander's hand tighter than ever. He leaned in, meeting her eyes. And in that moment, there was no contract, no agreement, no fear, just a man beside the woman delivering his children. The first cry rang out. Sophie broke down, tears streaming down her face, from pain, exhaustion, and something else that had no name. Alexander stood frozen. He had never heard a sound that stopped his breath like that. A nurse brought over the first baby, a boy, his skin warm pink, his tiny lips pursed as if ready to cry again. Alexander reached out. The same hands that approved billion-dollar deals with a simple nod now trembled as they held a fragile, living soul. Hello, little one, he whispered. And then the second cry came, softer, fainter, but unmistakably alive. It's a girl, the doctor said. Both babies are healthy. Alexander didn't move. In less than 3 minutes, his entire world had changed. He walked to Sophie, emotion raw on his face. You did it. Sophie, too weak to open her eyes, smiled faintly. Are they perfect? Perfect, he replied, his voice hoarse. That entire night, Alexander didn't leave the recovery room. He sat by the small bassinet, watching his 2 tiny angels sleep soundly. Every movement, every breath, they captured him completely. Every time one of them sucked their thumb, he smiled softly. Rachel entered just before dawn, holding a cup of hot coffee. Would you like to rest for a bit, sir? Alexander shook his head. No. For the first time, I don't want to miss a single moment. The sun was rising when Sophie opened her eyes. She saw Alexander holding the baby girl, gently rocking her in his arms, as if he had been doing it his whole life. She whispered, You're not really the kid type. And yet... Alexander turned, cutting her off with a rare smile. Maybe, I never was, but it looks like I'm learning fast. He stepped closer, gently placing the baby girl in Sophie's arms. "And you, Sophie, you are the best thing that's ever happened to me." Sophie looked down at the two precious lives in her arms, then up at Alexander, and for the first time, they didn't need to say anything more, because in that moment, one truth became clear. He wasn't just the man who had paid her to carry his child. He had become a father, and she had given him a family. A part of her heart wanted to stay. Another whispered, "Don't be foolish. When love has no name, can you really stay? Without a reason?" It had been a week since the twins first cried their way into the world. The luxury hospital where Sophie was recovering felt like a parallel universe, completely separate from the outside world of ambition, expectations, and contracts. In that quiet world, there were 3 adults, 2 tiny lives, and 1,000 unspoken glances. Each morning, Sophie sat by the window holding her babies, sunlight casting a golden hue across her messy hair. She hummed softly, sometimes forgetting the lyrics. But the twins still slept peacefully, their tiny hands clasped together, as if an invisible thread bound their hearts and everyone around them. Alexander never left for more than 2 hours at a time. He brought his laptop to the hospital, working from a private family lounge. Rachel joked that she'd never seen the busiest CEO in New York spend 30 minutes just watching a baby breathe. He only smiled, said nothing. Only Sophie noticed how often he looked at her, longer than necessary. Only she heard the moments he stepped forward to speak, and then pulled back. That afternoon, a light rain fell. Alexander walked the corridor carrying the baby boy in his arms. From a distance, Sophie watched. His tall, broad figure now gently cradling a newborn, like that awkward motion was the most important thing in the world. Rachel appeared quietly behind her. "He's changed." Sophie smiled, bittersweet. "Yes, but I'm not sure if it's because of me or because of the babies." Rachel paused, then asked softly, "Have you told him yet? Told him I'm leaving? Told him you don't want to leave anymore?" Sophie didn't answer. She simply stared at the door at the end of the corridor, where Alexander stepped through, his eyes lighting up when he saw she was waiting. That evening, after the twins had fallen asleep, Sophie stepped out into the small hospital garden. Alexander was already there. No invitation, but somehow they always found each other. Sophie walked over to stand beside him, the night breeze catching strands of her long, unbrushed hair. "Do you think, if there hadn't been a contract, we still would have met?" Alexander didn't look at her. He looked at the cloudy sky. "No, I wouldn't have stopped my car at that intersection. Wouldn't have let someone into my life without clear terms. So, what if I tore up that contract right now?" Alexander turned to her. For the first time, his gaze wasn't guarded. It wasn't cold. There was only one thing, a silent hope. "I wouldn't stop you." "And if I said, I can't leave?" Alexander took a slow breath. "Then I'd ask, why you want to stay?" Sophie stepped closer, now only half a step away. Her eyes shimmered with tears. "I'm staying because I can't walk away from the thing that finally taught me what love truly is." Alexander extended his hand, not to pull her in, just open, between them. "I won't promise to be the perfect man, but I promise I'll learn." Sophie nodded, slowly placing her hand in his. A simple touch, no force, no signature, just a choice. Willingly made. 2 days later, Sophie returned to the mansion with the twins, and Alexander. No one asked questions. No explanations were needed. Rachel stood on the steps, smiling. "Welcome home." That night, Sophie lay next to the sleeping babies, eyes heavy with exhaustion. Alexander entered, holding a thin blanket. He gently covered her with it, whispering, "Sophie." She opened her eyes slightly. "Yeah? If one day you want to name them, I hope you choose something that feels warm to you, because they'll carry it for life, just like I've carried the name of the woman who once walked away from me." Sophie clutched her hand to her chest, then nodded. "I understand, and this time I won't leave anyone behind." There was no contract tying them together, but the trust written on no paper became the most permanent vow of all. After returning to the mansion, nothing changed in grand, dramatic fashion like in the movies. It was just quieter, softer, gentler. The mansion that once felt vast and cold was now filled with the sounds of baby babble, faint giggles, and the tiny hiccups of newborns in the middle of the night. Sounds Alexander once thought of as life disruptions now became the only thing that made him feel alive. One early morning, just as the sun peeked through the row of poplars, Alexander entered the living room and stopped in his tracks. Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch, arms wrapped around the baby boy still dozing peacefully. The baby girl's hand rested softly on her mother's hair, as if unconsciously checking. "Are you still here, Mummy?" Alexander didn't move. He simply stood there, watching. A moment later, Rachel walked by, paused, and whispered, "You should take a picture. One day you'll want something to remind you why you changed." Alexander responded, voice quiet as breath, "I don't need a photo. This moment is already etched in my mind." A few days later, once things began settling down, Rachel suggested, "We should name the babies. Birth certificates, insurance, passports. It all needs to be done soon." Sophie was feeding the baby girl. She looked up at Alexander. He looked back at her. "You name them, I promised. You'd choose whatever feels warmest to you." Sophie smiled softly. "I've been thinking about this since I was still pregnant." She turned to Rachel. "The boy, I want to name him Ethan. It means strong, because he came into the world amidst so much uncertainty and still held steady." She looked at the baby girl in her arms, and the girl, Hope, because she was the only light that carried me from my old life into something new. Alexander nodded slowly. "Ethan and Hope, I love it." That same afternoon, Alexander asked his personal lawyer to prepare the birth certificates. But when the lawyer asked about the mother's designation, Sophie hesitated. She didn't want to be labeled surrogate mother with clinical coldness. Alexander noticed her pause. He turned to the lawyer. "Right, Father Alexander Reed. Mother Sophie Laurent, no annotations, no disclaimers." The lawyer hesitated. "But legally," Alexander interrupted, "I don't need the law to define what this relationship is." Sophie looked at him, long and steady, then slowly nodded. That evening, over a quiet dinner in the warm kitchen, Alexander placed a small blue velvet box on the table. Sophie blinked in surprise. "What are you doing?" Alexander didn't kneel. There was no grand proposal. He simply opened the box. Inside was a necklace, its pendant shaped like two tiny leaves cradling each other like an embrace. "This isn't a ring, because this isn't a proposal. This is an invitation to stay." Sophie looked at him, her throat tightening. "Stay? For what?" Alexander's voice was deep, steady. "To be my partner. To be the mother of Ethan and Hope. To be the person I can't imagine life without. You don't have to change your name. You don't need to sign anything. I just need you to still be here. Every morning." A single tear slipped from the corner of Sophie's eye. She reached out, took the necklace and held it tightly. "I'll stay. But not for the children, not for the house, not because anyone told me to. I'll stay. Because for the first time, I believe in something that doesn't need to be written down to be real." That night, Sophie stepped into the nursery. The twins were fast asleep. She stood in the middle of the room, moonlight falling softly through the curtains onto the plush carpet. Alexander stood at the doorway, silent. Sophie turned. Their eyes met. "I'm scared, Ashi," she whispered. "Of what?" "That one day, all of this will disappear like a dream." Alexander stepped forward, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Then each day, we'll build it up, brick by brick, until one day you stop thinking it's a dream." And in that moment, no contracts were signed, no vows were spoken. Only two people, both once left behind by the world, choosing to walk toward each other, willingly, steadily, and without needing validation. Blood doesn't make a family, but those who choose to stay, even without being bound, do. 1 year after Sophie agreed to stay without a contract, the old hilltop mansion had transformed into an entirely different world. No longer silent and empty, no longer echoing with lonely footsteps down endless hallways. Now, each morning, the sun woke Alexander not with alarms or emails, But with Hope babbling from her crib and Ethan pounding on the bedroom door demanding, "Daddy, pick me up!" New normal, that's what Rachel called it. Whenever Sophie fumbled trying to finish lunch on time, or when Alexander had to master changing a diaper in under 3 minutes without triggering a meltdown, Rachel joked, "My boss is now busier than when he was running a global empire." Alexander didn't deny it. He had never done so many nameless tasks in his life, but he had also never felt so truly alive. One early autumn afternoon, Sophie brought the twins out to the garden. She sat on a wicker chair reading a book, while the two little ones played with fallen leaves along the path. Alexander appeared behind her, placing one hand on her shoulder, the other holding a small wooden box. "I just found this in the old study." Sophie opened it. Inside were sketches she had once drawn, a pencil draft of her first day at the mansion, a memory of the hospital, Hope's first smile, Ethan's tiny hand resting in Alexander's palm. She fell silent. "I thought, you didn't keep these." "Just because they're not on the walls," he said gently, "doesn't mean they're not kept in my heart." Sophie looked up at him, and in that moment all the doubts she had once carried, every hairline fracture in her trust, was mended by the way he softly kissed her forehead. That night, after the twins had fallen asleep, Alexander opened his laptop and sent a surprising email. It went to every senior member of the Reed Global Board. The message was only 3 lines. "I'm officially stepping down from my executive role starting next quarter. I'm not leaving the company, but from now on, family comes first." Responses flooded in within 30 minutes, some shocked, some supportive, some resistant. But none of them changed his mind. Because Alexander knew he had once had everything, reputation, power, unimaginable wealth, and still felt empty, until Sophie and the twins walked into his life. A week later, Alexander hosted a small gathering in the garden. Only the closest friends and staff were invited. Not to announce his career move, but to celebrate 1 year since Sophie chose to stay. No vows, no extravagant wedding, just loving eyes, a soft song playing from an old wooden speaker, and a small cake Rachel brought out, handwritten in icing, "For the family we chose." Sophie stood beside Alexander, holding Hope in her arms. Ethan clung to his father's leg. She leaned in and whispered, "I used to think families like this only existed in my drawings." Alexander smiled, "And I used to think you were just a sketch. Turns out you're the masterpiece of my life." They touched their foreheads together. A quiet confirmation spoken without words. "We've made our choice, and this time no one is leaving." 3 years later, the first thing Alexander hung in his new home office was a watercolor painting. It showed Sophie, Hope, and Ethan sitting by the window, the soft light of sunset casting a warm golden glow on their hair. Beneath the painting, Sophie had handwritten, "This isn't a family born from blood, but it's where love chose to stay, forever." Alexander read those words every morning and smiled. 3 years later, the mansion was filled with golden light and the sound of 2 children's laughter echoing like a symphony of joy. Sophie stood at her easel, sketching her little family. Alexander walked over, wrapped his arms around her from behind, and together they looked at the painting slowly coming to life. "What do you think you'll name this one?" Alexander whispered. Sophie smiled, put down her brush, and turned to him, her eyes full of love. "Home," she said. Simple, but everything, because they understood family isn't built only on blood. It's built on love, trust, and the choices we make to stay by each other's side, even without a contract to bind us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment to share your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more touching stories ahead. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of love, hope, and the families we choose.